Hello, everyone, to the Purple Goat podcast with me, Luke.
Josie.
And today's episode may be a controversial one. It's about, is Comic Sans as bad as you think? So, Josie, what do you think about Comic Sans?
I mean, I suppose it's a widely unpopular font, which is why we're talking about it. But as Luke's told me, is also a very accessible font. But despite that, I still wouldn't use it.
Yeah. So, why wouldn't you? Like, what don't you like about it?
I think for me, Comic Sans, I mean, the hint's in the name, I would expect to see that font in a comic.
Okay.
And if I see it anywhere else, I think I find it a bit jarring because it feels out of context.
Okay.
And it doesn't look quite right.
Okay.
Like imagine if I was to send you an email in Comic Sans, I think that would throw you off.
Okay.
I mean, you can disagree, but...
Maybe you should give it a go, Josie.
I actually sent Carmen an email once in Comic Sans just to, mix it up. She did comment that it wasn't Comic Sans and that she was going to forgive me for it, but yeah.
So I really want to focus in there on that point that you said that it's out of context. I think for me, when I think about Comic Sans as a font, I think it's really important to think about why it was made and in what context we see it, and perhaps why, as you said, it probably has got the rep it's got. I think a good place to start, though, is to really give like a background to the font and to really explain why we use it, and how it came to be. So it was created by someone called Vincent Canard. I believe that's how you say their name. But basically, Vincent was tasked... the stories slightly differ depending on what sources you get from. But basically, the long and the short of it was that Microsoft back in the day needed a more like jokey, comic-y font to go alongside their other ones. They were making it back in 1995. They were creating a chat dog thing for their for the interface, and they needed like a comic-y font to go with the comic-y dog. And so Comic Sans was made. However, it was never actually used for that, but it was still put into Windows everywhere anyway. And I think for me, really when it comes down to why people hate Comic Sans, it's what are we using it for? Like, it's being used in Word documents and PowerPoints, like not very appropriately. And I think,
Do you think certain fonts, I mean, I don't want to say that each font has a personality, but would you say that they have a certain tonality about them?
Now, if I were a typography expert, master crafter of the fonts, I would tell you about how Bodoni is fancy and refined and elegant, and how Helvetica is timeless and classic. Everyone's...
What font am I? If I was a font, if I was a font, Luke, which font would I be?
Oh,
if you say Comic Sans, I'm going to be deeply upset.
No, you know what? I'm going to go with Century Gothic.
Thing is, it's going to mean nothing now because I have no idea what that is.
It's a good font.
Okay.
I like.
I'm going to look it
Gothic.
up afterwards.
I like Century Gothic. It's it's very modern, very geometric, bit rounded. It really, it's one of the timeless fonts, I think. It always,
like that.
It's always one that it's like, you can always rely on. It's always there in the back pocket.
And what font do you think resonates with you?
Oh gosh. Wingdings.
No, no, you're not a Wingdings. No, absolutely not. I'm going to go scroll through all our fonts now. I'm going to find you font. But yeah, no, go back to the history of Comic Sans.
So, basically, a lot of the time, the reason why people use Comic Sans and why we wanted to discuss it today was because Comic Sans is often thought as a font that is used to help dyslexic people be able to interpret text easier. And so when it comes to that claim, and we look at the actual evidence behind that claim, there is the scientific evidence on whether that particular font is more accessible than other ones is mostly anecdotal. There's no actual real solid hard scientific proof that says Comic Sans is more accessible, and if you use it, you're going to be helping people with dyslexia. Like,
okay, but is there a most accessible font out there?
Well, this is kind of the other side of it in terms of Comic Sans, because Comic Sans at the same time, while it's not a more accessible font, it still has characteristics of it that make it that pertain to what a lot of accessible fonts would have. It's what we call sans serif, which means it doesn't have the little flicks on the edge that you'd expect from something like Times New Roman or Bodoni or something like that. It's not italicized either. Italicized fonts are typically not as good either for legibility, and it has other things that we see in that kind of make it one of, while the evidence is out on whether it's the most accessible font, for evidence into which fonts are the most accessible ones kind of pertains more so to, kind of by coincidence, pertains to Comic Sans being one of the more accessible fonts. So there are actually other fonts that would probably be as accessible, like, your Helvetica, Arial, Verdana, fonts that have those similar sort of characteristics. They might look different, but they still have the characteristics of more accessible fonts. So when using Comic Sans, you're not being the most accessible by using it, but you're not being inaccessible either. You are using a font that is accessible, but scientifically speaking, is no way more legible than similar fonts with similar characteristics, although individuals' opinions vary.
Okay, so for clarity, Comic Sans, accessible, but by no means the most accessible.
Yeah.
And there's equally accessible fonts out there, right?
Yeah.
I know you touched on the characteristics. In terms of what makes something, like a font, accessible, what are those kind of key characteristics? Yeah.
So I think the real big one that I touched on there was the idea of a sans serif font. When you want to pick a font that is more accessible, that has better accessibility, you really want to pick one that doesn't have all of those, as I say, flicks and little bits on the end. Like they're just, that is the big number one. Italics as well. Other things as well that are also important are thinking about things like the spaces between the letters as well. If you've got something that's too cramped together, that can also be quite inaccessible. What might be referred to as a condensed font. And also in case there are any, right, I'm just going to make something clear as well. If there are any typography experts out there and you hear me using font instead of typeface, I'm using them interchangeably. A bit of history about fonts more generally, Josie, is what we call a font is actually called a typeface, and there's probably someone screaming in the comments right now saying you called it a font and it's actually a typeface. I'm using it interchangeably because most people refer to it as a font.
Okay, so accessible fonts, typefaces, is there a lot of them out there that are accessible, or is there a restricted amount?
Oh no, there's lots. Like, you've still got plenty of options out there.
Because I have noticed, when Luke's our designer, when we do design projects, whether that's our proposals, decks, PG branding, client branding, whatever it is we're doing, you don't actually use Comic Sans.
No, I do not.
Is there a particular reason?
Because it's not appropriate to that situation.
Yeah, it doesn't feel it, is it?
No. And that brings us back to the title of the episode.
Yeah.
Why do people hate Comic Sans? And I kind of alluded to this a little bit, and then I didn't, and I kind of skipped over it. This idea that's used very much out of context. Now, as you kind of said, Josie, at the start, you would imagine it to be used in a comic kind of setting, like you wouldn't like,
or like a children's book. Like I remember when you started learning your letters, and you had like A, B, C, and like you had kicking cur and curly cur.
Yeah.
That's the kind of font I kind of think about.
Yeah.
So if I was to do any sort of like professional or like just anything, it would feel out of place.
Yeah. No, that's and that's absolutely fair.
Yeah.
Like, I think a lot of the time, a lot of our experiences with Comic Sans as a font are revolved around times where it's not used where it should be. Like, I think a lot of the times where we see it and we grow to hate it is things where, like, you'll see someone use it on a Word document or a PowerPoint presentation, and that's not where it should be used. It's because Comic Sans has that kind of playfulness about it, because it's not like it's not very rigid. It doesn't really follow a lot of the conventions that a lot of fonts like carry. Like, that to me doesn't, like, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have its place. It just means that its place isn't implemented properly. Like, I've started to play around a bit with Comic Sans recently, just like because I think it's interesting. Like, let's explore what it can do rather than what it can't do. And I think one thing that I've found with Comic Sans in particular is when you start to add it with, like, very heavy graphics, like very designed graphics, very vector graphics, like very clean, it does start to bring on a bit of a personality. Like, it does start to feel like you're using it appropriately. Like, if you use some decorative elements there in the background, maybe you could make, add a bit of shadow, but like a nice solid shadow behind it. It really starts to move, like, it starts to become its own. But then I think a lot of people probably don't have access to the tools that would allow them to make use of Comic Sans in that way, which is why it probably is much hard. Like, it's much harder to use. So, like, for instance, all those examples I talk about, I'd probably use Adobe software to, like, implement them. But 99% of people don't have Adobe.
Cool.
Or the ways to be able to create that. And, like, that's why I think, to me, this whole idea of what is good design and bad design is really interesting, because it really, like, it really comes down to our experience of where we see things and how we see things implemented, I think. And if we recontextualize things or reverse the rules or change our understanding of how things can be implemented, could our opinion change on such things?
Yeah. I think just to build on that, like, whilst you may not specialize in typography, if I can say the word right, but you do specialize in inclusive design, right?
Yeah.
So when you're designing something, whatever it may be, how do you go about choosing a font for whatever you're designing? Like, what are your kind of top tips for someone who's maybe listening to this, watching this, who want to be inclusive, but are now thinking, now I've discussed it, what the hell do I do?
Okay. I think the way to pick out a font, if it's, to figure out, is this font accessible? Go for something that's quite what we'd call, I guess, what you'd say plain. Not very many decorative elements at all. Make sure it's got good spacing. Good amount of thickness as well. Like, you don't want...
Sorry, funny conversation. Yeah, carry on.
You don't want a font that's, like, so thin you can barely see it because it's a twig. Something with a bit of weight to it, as we say, goes a long way as well. So, and if you're in any doubt, the saying goes, if in doubt, use Helvetica. Like, you can never go wrong with Helvetica or Futura or Arial.
How we're concluding the episode. Just use this one font. You can't
use if you don't know, use Helvetica or use one that looks like Helvetica. That's probably, like, the best way I can boil it down.
Cool. So let's say you're interested in Comic Sans.
Good choice.
Good choice. Should you be using it for one? Because, I mean, it is an accessible font.
Yeah.
But how do you use it? Like, where should we be using it if it is relevant? Basically,
I think when using Comic Sans, you've got to use it in a way that's very much supported by the graphics that surround it. I think using it by itself on a PowerPoint presentation as a black font on a white background is not going to end well. If you use it with, like, some saturated colours, some decorative elements, saturated but not too saturated colours, I guess, really play around with the font itself, see if there are any ways you can make it look more visually interesting outside of how just the default font looks. I think that's the place to really start exploring with it, and just try. Just don't be afraid to just experiment with it.
I mean, it's a difficult one. I mean, obviously, we should be encouraging people to experiment as much as they want with typography, wherever they want to. But if it was me, I'm not a designer, I'm not a typographist, whatever. I don't know my typography, but I will know Comic Sans if you were to put Comic Sans in something. So for me, I still wouldn't feel comfortable using it, but I think absolutely try it.
I think that's okay though. I think I think if you're not, at the same time, if you're not comfortable using a font or you don't want to use a font, then don't.
I suppose it doesn't feel me either. Like, I think people will be like, yo, Jose, why have you written that in Comic Sans? Like, imagine if I wrote a piece of whatever content and I put it all in Comic Sans. I think you would be surprised.
I would be it would be surprising because it would be out there, and I think a lot of people wouldn't know how to respond to that.
Yeah.
But I think.
But I get what you're saying. Experiment it. I'm just saying that I'm not going to start using it. I stick where I stand. I'm not changing my opinion, even though it's accessible.
That's absolutely fine, because that's the thing, is there are lots of other fonts out there, and everyone has their preferences. I mean, there are people out there, believe it or not, that just like it. Yeah. Like as much as the internet says we should all hate Comic Sans, there are people who just genuinely like it, and they'll just use it, and it's like, more power to you.
Okay.
I
mean, to summarize, I will say, still not a big fan. It's not my favorite font. I'm not going to use it, but I can accept that it is an accessible font. I would still like us to use other fonts, though.
It's okay. We will use other fonts, Josie. Okay, so thank you for watching or listening, or both, to the Purple Go podcast. Some people might have just watched it. I don't know.
Thanks for turning up, guys.
Thanks for turning up. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications if you're on YouTube. Follow us if you're on Spotify. And otherwise, you should follow Purple Go Agency on Instagram, TikTok, and all your other favourite social platforms.
I love that bit.
Bye.
Bye, guys.